Hello, this is Dr. Bob Evans, and welcome to our podcast, Parental Alienation from Couch to Courtroom and Beyond. We will discuss the resisting and refusing dynamic, commonly referred to as parental alienation, how you'll know it's happening in your case, and what can be done about it. Parental alienation can cause stress and trauma in high-conflict cases. These podcasts focus on how attorneys and mental health professionals can support families and children. In the American Journal of Family Therapy in 2024, the authors are Edward Crook, K-R-U-K, and Jennifer Harmon. The title of the article is Countering Arguments Against Parental Alienation as a Form of Family Violence and Child Abuse. Every time I go to court, virtually every time, I probably shouldn't exaggerate, I'm confronted by arguments about parental alienation not being a valid issue, not being a valid science, that there's not enough research, it doesn't pass a Daubert or a Fry test, and it goes on and on and on, especially arguments coming from a favored or alienating parent's attorney. And so I think it's important for people to understand that that is total misinformation. Now, I characterize it as misinformation as information that is simply wrong, perhaps because the person's not aware of the history or the details of the research on parental alienation, as opposed to disinformation, where it's a deliberate attempt to mislead the court with false information. And that happens too, very, very frequently. So look, one of the arguments that are typically raised in a court case is that there's a lack of credible peer review research on parental alienation. There's totally misinformation. That's totally not true. Actually, the concepts of parental alienation have been published in 10 different languages over the past 2 decades. Since 2016, 40% of the research and the literature that exists in the topic has been published. In addition, we're looking at thousands of articles, books that have been published on the topic, multiple studies, both qualitative and quantitative research, that are housed at Vanderbilt University and published in numerous peer-reviewed journals around the country, around the world. Interestingly, in researching the topic, it's actually encoded in the legal criminal law within the country of Brazil, interestingly enough. So the idea that there's no scientific basis for the concept of parental alienation is totally erroneous. And people who continue to maintain that position are really trying to misinform the court. They have to know, with a little bit of research, they have to know that it's very easy to find scientific background for the concepts. Now, another argument that comes up is that there's organizations such as the American Psychological Association. They don't recognize parental alienation as a legitimate scientific construct. And part of the argument is, well, because it's not in the DSM-5. Well, dealing with the American Psychological Association, clearly they recognize it. It's not only mentioned they have a handbook of forensic psychology where the whole concept of parental alienation is discussed. They just published a new guidelines for custody evaluators in 2022, and it's multiple references to alienating behaviors that evaluators need to pay attention to. So the idea that the American Psychological Association doesn't recognize it is totally false as an argument or a concern. The idea that it's not in the DSM-5 is an old argument. Basically, there are multiple diagnoses that are in the DSM-5 that cover the concept of parental alienation, multiple of them. Actually, a lot of research on some of the instruments that actually assess it are referenced in terms of the diagnostic categories that exist. Another very common argument is raised where the opponents of parental alienation maintain that the concept is corrupted because there's a presumption that because there's no contact, there's a contact disruption between a parent and a child, therefore people like me argue that that's alienation, that's parental alienation. Well, that's totally untrue. It takes a lot more of a diagnostic process to identify parental alienation than simply a relationship disruption or no contact between a child and a parent. So the idea that we argue that alienation is simply a concept of, one parent, one child not getting along, therefore there's alienation, that is totally not true. And we have a 5-factor model which we have to use to identify the whole process of alienation to see if there's documentation for it. So it's important for courts to understand that what they're hearing from the opposing attorney is misinformation, in many cases, disinformation, deliberate attempts to mislead the court. Another misinformation offered to courts is that advocates of parental alienation are really advocates for shared parental responsibility. Well, that's a case-by-case decision that has to be made, not as a blanket argument against parental alienation. If there is alienation going on, shared parental responsibility, shared parental custody may not be appropriate. If you have one parent who's deliberately misleading the child, fabricating allegations against the other parent, i.e. brainwashing the child against the other parent. So shared parental responsibility and shared custody would mean that the child would be with that parent half of the time approximately, being able to continue with their propaganda. Another argument that's always brought up frequently is that abusive men hide behind the label of parental alienation, thereby blaming the alleged victim of domestic violence. There's been a very recent body of research that's been surfaced through Jennifer Harmon and Dr. Lorenzos that basically has demonstrated that that's not true, and that the court cases do not favor arguments of parental alienation, especially when there's allegations of domestic violence and abuse. So the whole issue of men hiding behind that, do some men do that? Absolutely. Do some women do that? Absolutely. But the issue is it a blanket argument or condemnation against parental alienation? The answer is no. There is an argument that says the occurrence of parental alienation is very low. It's a very small percentage of cases. Well, I don't know if that's accurate enough. I don't know if anybody knows the actual percentage of cases where alienation exists or not exists, but we're finding that 32 to 36% of parents in the U.S., Canada, and UK report being targeted of alienating behaviors. That's a recent study by Jennifer Harmon in 2019. So I think the percentage is even higher. The authors of the book, Children Held Hostage, basically talk about alienating behaviors in 86% of the cases. That's a significant amount. How much of that totally has an effect on a child where the child is actually rejecting a parent? Well, we don't know. But it's not that rare of an occurrence. And it's frankly a lot more frequent than people want to acknowledge. One of the things that we know in terms of trying to get an alienated child and a rejected parent together requires a specific program, specific techniques to help reestablish that relationship. And the programs that do that all basically require a period of no contact between the child and the favored or alienating parent. And arguments will constantly come into court that that's just a draconian kind of approach. It's going to harm the child beyond, any imagination. The child's already stressed out and traumatized, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the reality is that there's absolutely no research to support the argument that removing a child from a parent for up to 90 days in order to reestablish their relationship with the other parent has had any harmful effects on it. And in fact, the ultimate goal, programs like Family Bridges out of Toronto, Canada, the ultimate goal is to reestablish the extended family and basically help both parents be able to resume their parental role and responsibility. Jennifer, another argument that's frequently heard is that, the alienating behaviors typically would just backfire on the person who's executing them, like the alienating parent. So it really is unlikely that alienation could have an effect on the child the way we present it in court. Well, the reality is there's a large number of studies that have demonstrated that basically the alienating behaviors do in fact have a negative effect on children and does affect their relationship with the other parent, among other things in terms of how it affects them psychologically and medically, physically. So the argument that, there's a backlash or a boomerang effect, it doesn't hold. The research doesn't support that concept. In wrapping up after a kind of a brief podcast here, the idea that, parents have a tremendous influence on children. We teach children the moral values. We teach them how to behave. We teach them courtesy. We teach them how to respect other people, other adults. There's a lot of teaching going on between parents and children. And when you have a case where a child is rejecting a parent, that's not normal. That's not natural. Something has happened in that relationship. Now, is the child rejecting a parent who deserves rejection? In other words, that parent has been abusive and neglectful and a horrible parent? If that's not the case, then why would a child be rejecting a parent unless there's some sort of outside influence? Children just don't wake up one day and decide to reject a parent. That doesn't happen. That has to be encouraged, reinforced. The idea has to be instilled in the child. And quite frequently, we see that basically that child is more fearful of the alienating or favored parent than they are when they argue against the targeted parent. So alienation is real, it hurts, and it needs to be more generally recognized and understood by legal and mental health professionals. Thank you so much for joining us today. For more information on this topic, please visit www.drbobevans.com or www.naopas.com. We offer classes for both legal and mental health professionals to help educate them on the signs and strategies of parental alienation and how to move forward for a healthier environment for the children of divorce. Please visit www.naopas.com and sign up for our courses and use coupon code PODCAST for a 50% discount.